So next up, we have Giulio Shania, who is a PhD student in economics at the University of Oxford. Thanks, Giulio.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks. So thanks so much for inviting me to present this work with Tanguy Bernard, Stefan Deuken, Kate Orkin, and Alemanya Seyum Tafesse, The Future in Mind, Aspirations and Future-Oriented Behavior in Rural Ethiopia. The motivation for this work is probably common knowledge to most of us, and the fact that role models matter. And this is a quote from Justice Sonia Sotomayor, giving us an example of how role models can be a confirmation of how possibilities one may have every reason to doubt are actually things that we can achieve if we have somebody that we can look up to who looks like us, who has had a similar background as us. And in particular, we want to try and answer the question as to whether exposure to role models can have persistent effects on economic behavior. And successful individuals, like the quote that I gave earlier, often cite role models as an inspiration for their achievements, but we know that often disadvantaged groups may lack exposure to role models, or they can relate with, possibly because there are fewer of those, or possibly because those individuals have left their communities. But there are studies, and we have already started talking about them in the previous talk, that show that exposure to role models can change occupational choices or subject choices, in particular among students or women who end up going into STEM careers. But there is still a lack of evidence, which this paper is trying to fill, on whether exposure to role models can have lasting effects on adulthood, on economic decision making. So this paper is going to experimentally vary exposure to role models, and treated individuals are going to be invited to watch documentaries about 4 role models from similar backgrounds as the study participants, that through their own efforts, careful planning, and hard work have managed to escape poverty and improve their socioeconomic well-being. We find persistent effects after 5 years after exposure to those videos on measures of effort, agricultural and educational investment, as well as some noisier estimates on assets. And we measured a range of potential psychological mechanisms to try and explain those effects on economic decision-making. And we find evidence that is consistent with persistent shifts in aspirations or goals that individuals had about their income, wealth, or education for their children. And on top of that, we try and rule out several other mechanisms, and in particular, just pure exposure to media, given this was a sample, as I'll get onto into a minute, that wasn't particularly exposed to different types of media through a placebo group, as well as trying to measure spillovers using a comparison between within village, within cluster individuals, and a pure control set of individuals in clusters that weren't treated. Although there are some caveats that I will get into later. So we kind of explain the results using a conceptual framework which builds on existing reference-dependent utility theory and other papers that have built-in aspirations in economic modeling. And this is simply done by adding a concave gains loss function that is increasing in the reference point gap. That is the difference between what you're consuming now and what you aspire to consume. And basically, we kind of solve an intertemporal labor consumption decision, and we see that a current increase in the aspiration, given this is an intertemporal problem, will shift current consumption, reduce current consumption at leisure now towards future consumption later, and so savings and increased labor supply later. And this is going to have an effect on assets. So details are in the paper. I just wanted to mention that as the explanatory lens that we use to understand the results. So giving you more of a sort of understanding of what the sample was about and why this study is not trying to claim external validity is the fact that this is a very specific sample of individuals that lived in Ethiopia, in a rural, isolated, poor district, in a remote area far away from the capital, who was mostly made up of subsistence farmers. The majority had only seen TV once in the last year, and only 12% had traveled outside of their district in the last year. And in the sample, future-oriented behavior, so things that we might associate with thinking about the future, wasn't always the present. 58% used any sort of modern agricultural technology, such as fertilizer or seeds, and only 45% of the sample used veterinary supplies or feed for their livestock. Enrollment wasn't universal among school-age children, and savings was only reported among 37% of households. So just to give you snapshots of what the videos look like, these were videos made by the research team using local actors, describing stories, narratives. There were 4 videos of 15 minutes each of 2 men and 2 women that describe how they saved money, they sought support from available community members, and carefully planned their choices and their future decisions so that they could then improve their economic well-being. So this is an example of how, through saving, this individual that was narrating the story managed to increase their livestock assets. And the timeline of the study is as follows. So the baseline survey happened in 2010, and shortly after, individuals were randomly selected to participate in the screening of those videos. And then there was after the screening, there was a quick follow-up survey just to measure some of the aspirations-related measures. Then there was an immediate follow-up study after 6 months. Some of you may have already seen the working paper of that, of those results, which happened in March and May 2011. And what I'll be telling you mostly about is the follow-up studies after 5 years, which happened in 2015, 2016, where the pure control group of villages was added. And this kind of summarizes what I already said about the experimental design and the fact that households were randomized into these 3 groups. There was a treatment group that watched those documentaries about inspiring individuals and role models. There was another group within the same cluster of villages that was just watched an entertainment video, and that was to try and get at the comparison between the treated group and the group that watched this other video, just because exposure to media could have had some effects just in and of itself. And there was a within village control group that was just surveyed in the clusters that were treated. And finally, in 2016, a pure control group was added, and this was not a randomly selected group of villages. From what this map shows, the white dots are the pure control villages, and those were excluded from the study because of logistical reasons. Whenever there were groups of 5 or 6 villages that were close to the screening location, those were the ones that were slightly further away from the screening location and were excluded from the study. But as you can see from this map, they still lie fairly close to the treated villages, and across the set of village level characteristics, they are balanced relative to the treated clusters. So I'll be mostly talking and using as our main specification the following equation, estimating equation, where I'll be focusing on comparisons between the gamma coefficient, that is the treatment effect, relative to a difference with the placebo, but also looking at how the effects compare relative to the group that was just surveyed. And if I have a little bit of time, I'll also show some of the spillover effects, which I anticipate are mostly null. Attrition was low relative to other standards. There was a high follow-up of almost 90% of the study participants after 5 years, and it was not predicted by several variables, and compliance to the treatment was high. So I'm going to jump into the results, and this table is showing you Anderson indices which had not been pre-specified about the 5-year follow-up outcomes. So let me walk you a little bit through the table. We did pre-specify the outcomes that make up the indices. We didn't pre-specify the fact we're going to group them into these indices. And this table shows on the rows the outcomes, and on the columns the coefficients on the treatment indicator, the placebo indicator, and the difference between the two. And then in the 4th column, the control group mean, and the standard deviation is in the parentheses. In the square brackets, there are Q values across these outcomes. So we find persistent effects of nearly 0.2 standard deviations on agricultural investment, while they are lower relative to the placebo group, and also in educational investments, and a measure and a set of welfare outcomes that I won't have the time to go into the details of, but I'll tell you a little bit about what the Agricultural Investment Index is made up of. It's made up of measures of labor supply, so we find that individuals work on average 46 minutes more per week after having seen those videos 5 years later. And we find that these individuals, at least on the extensive margin, report higher probability of having used any modern crop inputs, such as seeds or fertilizers, and they seem to be spending more on these inputs, although the coefficients are a bit noisier, and so they're not statistically significant relative to the treatment versus placebo group comparison. We also find noisy, and I'm going to admit, not always significant relative to different specification that control for the baseline value of the outcome, increases in the assets, which are also measures that were included in the Agricultural Investment Index. So just a quick run through of what was driving the results in the other indices. We find increases in human capital investment through increased enrollment, primarily into children that were aged 11 to 15, so they were in the higher primary education cohort 5 years after, at the time of the videos, and 5 years after they are 16 to 20. And they seem to also have attained a higher level of education, almost doubling, but that's partly because it's rare in the sample for individuals to complete the full cycle of primary education, which goes up to 8 years. And we also find noisier, but always robust to a different specification, increases in the amount that individuals spend on education. I'm going to caveat that these are results that are borderline significant, and they're not large. We're not trying to claim that individuals that just watched the video made large changes to their decisions, but these are changes that we still find 5 years later. And the quality of life, the welfare measure, was mostly significant thanks to changes in non-durable consumption and self-reported measures of housing quality and a reduction in months of reported food insecurity. We didn't find any effects on food consumption. And after 6 months, we had seen already changes that can potentially explain why we find those persistent effects. Individuals that were treated reported saving more. They already reported working more in their farm, and we already found after 6 months that children in those households were more likely to be enrolled and increasing in the spending that these households had made towards educational expenses. Our kind of candidate that we think is consistent to explain these results is changes in the reference points that these individuals have. And the way we measure reference points, again, this is a sort of an Anderson index of different measures of reference points, which are a combination of three meso outcomes, which are aspirations, expectations, and the maximum level that this individual thinks that a person in their village can achieve across 3 dimensions. So these are not reported in the table, but you can see the significance of the effects in the table of how much people think that they would like to achieve in terms of income and wealth, or education for their children, how much they would expect, and this maximum measure. We are ruling out alternative mechanisms, such as concrete information that individuals could have gotten from the videos. So we don't find across a range of behaviors the fact that individuals were emulating what the role models were doing, such as seeking advice from agricultural extension workers, for example. And we find effects on human capital investments, which is not the type of behavior that the role models were actually engaged in the videos. We rule out effects on time preferences and risk aversion. We found some effects on a measure of locus of control after 6 months, but those did not persist after 5 years. And then I wouldn't really have time, although I wished I had, to discuss the spillover effects, which are mostly null. So if you believe our identification of spillover effects, given the caveats that I mentioned on the pure control group of villages, we try and measure them just comparing the control group with the within village control group with the pure control group. We don't find anything that is statistically significant, or if anything, it's positive, but not always statistically robust to multiple hypothesis testing. And we try and measure spillovers using 3 specifications, including randomization, saturation design, and radius-based spillovers approach. So just to conclude, this is my last slide. Just to kind of wrap up and kind of bring the main contribution on this paper is the fact that a light touch intervention has changed aspirations, what I call reference points and goals, and has had a persistent yet small impact on certain types of behavior, such as education spending and attainment of children in these households that were treated, spending and the decision to adopt certain types of agricultural inputs, and some effects also on the productive stock of assets. We think that these type of results are consistent with changes that are persistent in the reference point. And just to plug in something that was discussed in the previous talk, we found that the changes in these measures of aspiration expectations after 6 months were positive, but not always statistically significant. So they appear to actually have increased over time. And we posit that they might be potentially due to individuals making the right choices over time and increasing how much they believe they can achieve through that, not just through the socially determinant characteristics. So that's it.
I'm curious about your use of the word role model, because to me, often a key component of a role model is someone that you know personally and you have some sort of personal relationship with them. They can mentor you or help you in some way. And I know you said that these effects you think that they're not due to people just emulating the people that they saw in the videos. But another thing that could happen is, sure, like sometimes I see a person on the internet who went and like quit their job to like surf in Hawaii, and maybe that doesn't make me want to go and quit my job and surf in Hawaii, but I start thinking about, oh, well, maybe I could go live in Spain, or like kind of my own version of what that would look like for me. So I'm kind of, so I guess like, does that fit into the definition of role model? I don't know. But yeah, I'm curious how you think about like that personal relationship versus just kind of like broadening, like making people more creative about what kinds of things they could do in their future.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I take the point that role models would also have often a personal relationship with people that they are inspiring. But I guess the reason why I use that word is the fact that, at least in this sample, there is potentially a lack of individuals that have similar backgrounds that can provide that type of inspiration. There is, to some extent, a high degree of fatalism in this sample. So that's why I kind of wanted to caveat that it's relatively specific. So maybe as a Westerner myself, I would be exposed to a lot of potential examples that I could emulate. And I think the fact that these individuals, the actors, were talking about stories of communities that were nearby the ones of the study participants, in a way is consistent with giving me an example that isn't just about creativity, but something that can give me the confidence to think that I have possibilities that I may not have thought myself. So that's why I was using that word. But I take the point that maybe I should be pretty careful with language. It's the spin that we're trying to give to the introduction.
So thank you. This was a really interesting presentation, and I guess you sort of touched on the themes that I'm going to ask about, and maybe I'm just asking you to repackage what you had just said. But that I'm wondering to what extent you can explain or understand your results through purely an economic lens of Bayesian learning or observing other people and changing perceptions of what the returns to different activities are in a very kind of cold, calculating, rational way, versus needing to incorporate psychological concepts like self-efficacy or self-confidence in order to rationalize what you find. Is it possible to use only one lens, or does that not work with your results because they're of some aspect or another?
Thank you for this great question. So I don't remember off the top of my head. I think there are measurements of the beliefs to returns, and I don't remember having looked at them recently. But I think it is a plausible. I think it would change slightly the fact that, for example, we don't find we don't find effects on the consumption side. I'll have to think it through a bit more, but I don't think it's a purely learning about new technologies. I think it's learning about new possibilities, and those might be coming from a range of potential investments that might be most suitable to you, and that might be investments towards your children's education, as well as investments in fertilizers. So in a way, we're kind of taking a stance that individuals know what is best for them, but they might not think that through doing more of it, they could get better outcomes over time. And so the idea of the role models is to show them that by making careful choices through things that are already available to them, they can achieve better outcomes over the long run. So it isn't so much based on learning about specific technologies. We think that those are already, we kind of take a stance that those are already relatively common knowledge within the community, but it's about thinking that through more hard work, and that's potentially why we find effects on labor supply, individuals can change their outcomes over time.
Yeah, I had a question which is about the aspiration part. And I think you have a rich enough data set to be able to address the idea you have. So you have the controls, you don't change the aspiration. The others, you tell them, well, listen, you could be a lot more, you could do all these other things, okay? What about if I came to this place and said, okay, well, look, I'm going to show you a video about somebody who bought a lottery ticket, and yeah, they won the lottery, and this is what they did with it, and so on. And probably you and I would think, well, we know the odds of, the lottery ticket. It's probably not a good idea to encourage people to buy a lottery ticket. So in this particular case, it's because we understand that on average, you're not going to be winning from lottery tickets. So, but even in this case, even though it looks like on average, they're winning, it doesn't mean that everybody's winning. And so it would be interesting to see two things. One is the variance of experiences larger for the treated and for the control, which would suggest that some people are winning a lot, some people are not winning. And then you could still have the average to be higher, but not necessarily for everybody. And so if you do find that, it would be interesting to see who's losing, what predictors are of benefiting the most from this treatment and all that, just so that we can maybe target it better in the future.
Yeah, great question. So I have off the top of my head, not necessarily the variance, but if I kind of think about the community distribution function of some of the outcomes, it is the case that those effects are coming from the top of the distribution. Not necessarily outliers, we kind of trimmed at the 99th percentile, but it is people that are at the top. And I think I agree that we should do a little bit more perhaps to unpack whether there are characteristics that make those individuals slightly different from others. We did try several things. We did try some mediation analysis that didn't really help us to unpack the results. But maybe that's something that we can do some more work on. So thank you for that suggestion.